Between the 16th and 18th of September 1982, Christian Lebanese militias of the Phalangist Party massacred as many as 3,500 Palestinian refugees. All the while, the Israeli Defense Forces occupying the area provided support in the form of flares, mortars, and bulldozers for the mass graves. In today's video, we will cover the disturbing violence of the Sabra and Shatila massacre and just how such an event could take place. It is perhaps helpful to start with a brief explanation as to what was happening in Lebanon in 1982. Palestinian refugees had been in Lebanon in large numbers following the 1948 Palestine War and the formation of Israel as a state. Around 100,000 of the approximately 750,000 expelled Palestinians fled to Lebanon, but this number only continued to grow over the years. Many settled in southern Lebanon, living in refugee camps such as Sabra and Shatila. The camp was founded shortly after the Palestine War in 1949, and it grew from the Shatila district of Beirut to include parts of the Sabra neighborhood. Around 500 buildings made up the camp, growing ever taller to accommodate more and more refugees. Within this camp was a hospital staffed by international doctors and nurses who volunteered to assist in the dire conditions. It is thought tens of thousands of Palestinian refugees called the camp home, a camp that is still in existence to this day. It was from these refugee camps that resistance and terrorist groups were drawn, such as the Palestinian Liberation Organization or the PLO. During the late 1960s, PLO forces would carry out raids and attacks against both Israel and Lebanon. Lebanon was at the time a fractured country, and its armed forces were incapable of dealing with the PLO. In 1975, the country descended into civil war. One of the major factions that rose to prominence during this time was the Phalangists. This was a Lebanese Christian party inspired by European fascist parties and the Nazi Party. For example, the group used the Roman salute and they even wore brown shirts. Their ideology was focused on Lebanese Christian nationalism and stood in opposition to the Arab nationalists in Lebanon. The Phalangists and the Arab nationalists engaged in retaliatory massacres on one another. Phalangist roadblocks would see many Lebanese Muslims executed on the spot. Against this backdrop, Syria and Israel intervened in Lebanon to protect their interests, with Syria backing the Arab nationalists and Israel backing the Phalangists. Israel and the Phalangists had a common enemy, the PLO and the Palestinian refugees. In August of 1982, the leader of the Phalangists, Bashir Gemayel, was elected to be the president of Lebanon. Bashir had met with the Israel Defense Minister and future Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. Sharon explained Israel's plan to invade southern Lebanon and set up a buffer zone to prevent PLO attacks into Israel and to establish close ties between the two countries. This invasion saw the Israeli Defense Force clash with both the PLO refugees at their refugee camp bases and with the Syrian army, but Israel received criticism for its use of indiscriminate bombing in Lebanon, resulting in civilian casualties. The PLO often used refugee camps as bases to launch their attacks and raids into Israel, earning them criticism for using refugees as human shields. A faction of the PLO was also responsible for the infamous Munich massacre of the Israeli Olympic athletes. All the while, the PLO engaged in hijackings of planes and the launching of artillery strikes on Israel. Israel succeeded in killing and capturing thousands of PLO fighters, often with the aid of the Phalangists, who acted as scouts in identifying the PLO fighters. In August of 1982, peace terms were reached, with the PLO agreeing to leave Lebanon. This deal was known as the Habib Agreement, named after the American diplomat Philip Habib who orchestrated the deal. The agreement gave assurances to the PLO that if they left Lebanon, an international peacekeeping force would ensure the safety of Palestinian refugees still in the country. The evacuation of PLO fighters was completed by the end of August 1982. It was suspected, though, that as many as 2,000 PLO fighters had remained in Beirut, either to continue the fight or to protect the refugees. It was also thought that many of the PLO heavy weapons had been handed over to the Syria-aligned nationalist and leftist groups. This claim is disputed, though it is thought that not all fighters actually left Beirut. After the bulk of the PLO fighters and members of the PLO government left, so too did the international peacekeeping force, leaving the refugees with little in the way of any protection. On the 14th of September 1982, a large bomb killed Bashir. He was assassinated by a Syrian-associated leftist who had felt Bashir had sold Lebanon out to the Israelis. But it was initially thought that the PLO was responsible, and that this could have led to further chaos in a war-torn country. This assassination would also prove that the Phalangists ought to assist the Israelis in removing Palestinians from Lebanon. That very same evening, Sharon and the Chief of Staff of the IDF, General Raphael Etan, agreed that Israel should invade Beirut. Any attack on Beirut by Israel would utilize the Phalangists in a more aggressive role. The Phalangists had been looked down upon by many in Israel, as the IDF had engaged in much of the fighting against the PLO. For the attack on Beirut, it was decided by the Israelis that the Phalangists should play a role in the fighting. The IDF would not enter any of the refugee camps in Beirut. This would be a role strictly for the Phalangist paramilitary. On the 16th of September, at around 6 p.m, the Phalangists entered the Sabra and Shatila camp. As Israeli tanks surged into Beirut, some encircled the Sabra camp. No one was to enter or leave without their say-so. An Israeli command post was established on a building overlooking what would unfold just 200 meters away. Around 1,500 militiamen aboard Israeli jeeps and trucks entered. They were armed with guns, knives, and hatchets. From house to house, tent to tent, dwelling to dwelling, the Phalangists dragged those they found into the alleyways and the streets of the camp. At gunpoint, the refugees were separated as they looked for any sign of them being PLO fighters. One test was to have the men crawl on the floor. If they did it too well, it was apparently a sign of military training. Any man to have failed this test was shot. As night fell, Israeli troops fired flares over the camp, illuminating the grim work the Phalangists were carrying out. There were even reports of Israeli mortars fired into the camp. There are truly disturbing eyewitness accounts of the extreme violence carried out by the Phalangists. Many recall how they were asked about their nationality, hunting for Palestinians. Many have stated how they were made to either lie on the floor or were stood up against the wall before being executed by firing squad. There are photographs of piles of dead bodies slumped against walls. They are easily available to find online for those who wish to find them, but we can't show them here on YouTube. But be warned, it is truly horrific. One survivor, by the name of Ahmad Farid, recalls her terrible experience. She recalled the Phalangists raiding her home in the early hours of the morning and forcing them to face the wall. She was holding her 2-year-old son whilst her husband and young children were forced into position. She recalls hearing the gunfire, hearing her son shout for his daddy, and then seeing his skull explode. When she regained consciousness, she saw too that her husband and 3 of her children had been murdered. She survived with bullet wounds to her shoulders. Some accounts relay some of the motivations and justifications stated by the Phalangists. Some of them were told by the Phalangists it was revenge for the murder of Bashir. Some even justified the murder of younger people, stating that they would just grow up to be terrorists anyway. It was not just murder carried out by the Phalangists. There are also disturbing accounts of serious essay carried out on the refugees. Some accounts detail such scenes where women had been killed with an axe, dismembered after being violated. And it was not just Palestinians who were massacred. There are examples of Lebanese people too killed in the carnage. Some were simply attempting to reach the nearby Kuwaiti embassy, but were detained and murdered in the same manner as the Palestinians. Some Lebanese, who were neighbours of the refugees, even attempted to speak to the Israelis and Phalangists, only to be told that they should have done more to expel the Palestinians. They too were detained and killed. One notable witness is Ellen Segal, an American Jewish nurse who volunteered at the Gaza hospital in the camp. She recalls the patients brought in with serious injuries and desperate attempts to save as many as possible. She recalled how well-dressed phalangists rounded up the white doctors and nurses and forced them out of the hospital. The doctors attempted to hide one of their Palestinian staff with a white lab coat, but she was spotted and she was shot on the spot. Ellen recalls seeing the dead bodies littering the streets as she was forced out of the camp. There, she saw an Israeli bulldozer pushing bodies into a mass grave. The group of doctors and nurses were lined up against a bullet-ridden wall in front of a firing squad. But just before they were executed, an Israeli officer interrupted the phalangists, and the group of doctors were loaded onto trucks, and they were sent away. Ellen believed that the deaths of the Western doctors would bring far too much attention to the massacre, and so for this reason, they were spared. During the massacre, the phalangists were in radio contact with Israeli officers the entire time. Early into the raids on the first night, it is reported that a phalangist officer contacted an Israeli liaison and asked what should be done with a group of 45 or so civilians. The civilians had been rounded up. He was told to do the will of God, which is understood to have meant to kill them. Some of those captured were handed over to Israeli soldiers for questioning at a nearby sports stadium. During the interrogation, prisoners were threatened with being handed over to the phalangists if they did not comply, indicating that they were very well aware of what they were doing at the camps. Some of the massacres were carried out in sight of the Israeli blockade. Israeli bulldozers were used to dig mass graves inside the camps, with one of the largest being in full view of the IDF forward command post. This was also witnessed by a Norwegian envoy who saw the bulldozers load scoopfuls of bodies onto trucks just outside the camp. In other instances, houses with the bodies still inside were bulldozed, buried under the rubble. There are even examples of dynamite being used to demolish the so-called illegal homes, often with inhabitants still inside. In terms of the number murdered, no accounting has been possible. Whilst the International Red Cross began the work of uncovering the mass graves in the following days, it was not always possible to identify the dead. Around 1,300 bodies were uncovered, though this does not include the bodies buried underneath the rubble. When the news of the massacre became known, hundreds of thousands of Israelis protested the massacre. 400,000 people, accounting for 10% of Israel's population at the time, took to the streets. Israeli safety concerns about the threat posed by the PLO were justified in light of the attacks. But many of the protesters questioned why the IDF did not stop at creating a buffer zone and continue to encroach into Lebanon and ultimately assist in the massacre. Pressure mounted, and a judicial inquiry was carried out into the massacre. The report published in February of 1983 was unprecedented in the region and reconstructed the events of the massacre, including what the IDF knew and what they ought to have known. It was held that Sharon and General Etan bore responsibility for the massacre. Sharon was removed from his position as defense minister, but retained his position in the government as a minister without portfolio. Sharon would go on to become the Prime Minister. General Etan's commission was due to expire in the months after the report was published, and so the report recommended no further action be taken. For the phalangists and Israelis on the ground, no action has ever been taken for their roles in the massacre, and no similar investigation has ever been undertaken by the Lebanese authorities into those responsible for the massacre. The report has been criticized for stating that the Israeli command post had no visibility from their vantage point, and for stating that Israel only had a moral or indirect responsibility for the massacre. Nor was there any discussion as to whether the invasion of Lebanon was a correct decision. An international commission of inquiry that looked into the invasion of Lebanon as a whole would state that the Israeli objective at Sabra and Shatila was to make the camp uninhabitable, whilst seeking to break the spirit of the Palestinian national movement. The report noted that this was not just to demoralize the movement in Lebanon, but also in the West Bank and in Gaza. Others have noted the destruction of Palestinian homes, schools and hospitals, often framed as the destruction of terrorist infrastructure, and have said that this was an attempt to destroy a national community. Israel's occupation of Lebanon became a protracted involvement and saw the rise of the Iranian-backed terror group Hezbollah. This massacre is a disturbing example of the violence and the targeting of refugees. It is an understatement to say that the conflict is complicated, but what is far from complicated is the horror of murdering civilian refugees under the guise of rooting out terrorists. The role played by paramilitary groups with state backing and the dehumanization of refugees played a major role in the massacre. This is just one event in a wider story of an ongoing crisis, but vitally important to understanding the seamlessly endless cycle of violence.